Servite Priory, and welcome to this joint event involving ourselves in the Priory and the Royal Irish Academy. The Servite Priory, as you may know, was established in 1947 and has always been cross-community, ecumenical in its activities, and that we hope will continue into the future as the Priory moves into a new development in its evolution. And I'm very pleased that Father Bernard Thorne, the outgoing prior, is here this evening, and Bernard has provided enormous leadership, I have to say, to the Priory in recent times. The Servite community, of course, was established in, I think it was 1233 in Italy. And the Royal Irish Academy is relatively new innovation. It only came into being in 1785. So, we're very pleased to be joining with the Priory in the Servites in this joint venture this evening. We're also very pleased that the Reverend Suzanne Cousins, the rector of the Church of Ireland here in Benburb, is with us this evening, and with whom we have such very positive and strong relationships. This event involves the Benburb Priory Library and Museum, and in fact the Library and Museum was opened in 2017 by Archbishop Richard Clark and Archbishop Eamon Martin, and I know that Archbishop Martin's apologising for not being here this evening. He's had some knee surgery, but he certainly sends his very best wishes for this evening, and we're very pleased to see His Eminence the Cardinal here in our audience this evening. So this is a wonderful and important event, and an occasion where we want to hear and listen to what may have to be said about a vibrant civic society in Ireland today, the role of the Church. And I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Andrew Mayes, a dear friend of mine, a member of the Royal Irish Academy, a former Senior Vice President of the Royal Irish Academy, and former Professor of Hebrew at Trinity College Dublin. And he will maybe tell us a little about the fact that he grew up in this village as he introduces our guest speaker this evening. So over to you, Andrew.
I have two good reasons to be grateful to my good friend and colleague, Jerry McKenna. The first is that this is indeed a homecoming for me. Even though I've been maybe 60 years, nearly 60 years living in Dublin, nevertheless, it was here that I grew up. My father was rector here for nearly 20 years, from 1946 to 65. And indeed, Jerry referred earlier to the cross-community connections that the Servites foster. Well, they go right back to that time when the Servites first appeared, because here in Ireland, because then I do clearly remember in the rectory in Benburb having visits from the first prior of the Priory here, Father Keane. So those connections are long established, and I'm very glad to hear how well they are being fostered now. Anyway, as I say, I grew up in Benburb Rectory, I and my brothers and sister, and here we went to school, primary school. Here we attended church, and here we socialised and so on, and so formed all those habits of outlook and belief and so on that are so formative for later times. We did have occasional excursions to the Moy and to Armagh, but indeed the boundaries of Benburb really were the boundaries of our lives. So there's much for which I'm very grateful to Benburb, even though it's probably true to say that not all the good people of Benburb look back on the Mayes time in the rectory with equal pleasure. However, the second reason for my gratitude to Jerry is that it's a great honour for me indeed to welcome Archbishop McDowell to this, which is a meeting co-hosted with the Royal Irish Academy. Having been a rector in parishes in the Diocese of Connor, in the Diocese of Darren-Dromore, and then later having served as Bishop of Clogher and for the last 3 years as Archbishop of Armagh, he certainly needs no introduction. But this, I will say, anyone who has heard Archbishop McDowell speak or preach knows well his concern with and his commitment to the task of reconciliation. But uniquely, I think in his case, what he brings to this task is an understanding of the real problems in society which give rise to the need for reconciliation. And these he has described in terms of being the atomization or fragmentation of society. Now, that in turn is a situation which results from many factors, but one of those which he has identified again is the way in which there has been a quite clear breakdown in what he calls the meta-narrative or the grand narrative which holds society together. Perhaps another way of putting that is that unless we have a strong concern for the common good, then there's a real risk that society really falls apart into competing interest groups. Competing interest groups which are managed with more or less success by democratic governments. Now, that is the general context within which this theme of creating a vibrant society becomes, a vibrant civic society becomes so very important. So I'm very glad now to ask Archbishop McDowell to speak to us on that topic.
It's always difficult to get up after having been introduced so fulsomely, and we'll just see what happens in the next 3/4 of an hour or so. But first of all, if I could thank the Royal Irish Academy, and particularly its North-South Standing Committee in the person of Professor Jerry McKenna, for the very generous invitation to give a public lecture on this broad subject of the Church and the development of civic society. I'm very grateful for the opportunity. The word academy carries with it certain expectations, but as will become all too obvious before the hour is out, I'm not an academic in the sense of someone whose professional life is wholly dedicated to the scholarly pursuit of knowledge. And in that sense, this is not an academic paper with all the scholarly apparatus of footnotes and whatnot that you would expect with that discipline. So for that reason, at the outset, I want to acknowledge my debt to certain people and certain sources which I've drawn on to prepare this lecture, and also who have been an influence on my thinking over the years. Most obvious of all, and quite clearly he's not here to hear this, is St. Augustine, who is that divided genius who towers over Western Christian thought in so many spheres, and not least the subject at hand in that great book, The City of God, about the relationship between church, state and society. From my own tradition, and very much of what I have to say will be a sort of a sidelight on Anglican social and political theology, I'm most indebted to the late Archbishop William Temple, more recently to Rowan Williams, both of whom made tremendously creative contributions to thinking about the relationship between church, society and state. I'm also indebted in the Anglican tradition to a man called Father Neville Figgis, who was a monk of the Community of the Resurrection in Yorkshire, and who wrote towards the end of the 19th, early 20th century, and also in almost every way to Austin Farrer, scholar and theologian, and a kind of a maverick in all of those things, biblical scholar and theologian. So although I may not mention them by name very often, their thoughts in many ways are my thoughts, but brought together and channeled towards Ireland in a sense. But I would also want to acknowledge the work done at the moment by the Centre for Religion, Human Values and International Relations in Dublin City University, and particularly the work of the Centre's director, Philip McDonough, who is a retired senior Irish diplomat. He was the Irish ambassador to India and to Russia, intellectual and poet, and who has done a lot of contemporary thinking around the themes that we're talking about. And having said all of that, and I'm only on the first page, having said all of that, I should say that what I'm going to say tonight is entirely my own. They're entirely my own thoughts. They're not the thoughts of the Church of Ireland or any other church. They're simply my own personal contribution to the subject in hand. So if I could first of all offer an outline of not so much the substance as the manner in which I believe the church should make its contribution to the growth of a vibrant civic society, remembering that we now live in a properly pluralist society, and that the church no longer seeks, and should never have sought to, but no longer seeks to have the first word or the last word, but it has a word which may be distinctive and may be of benefit across a wide range of activities in civic society. I touched on this manner in which the church should speak in an article I wrote last June for the Belfast Telegraph, and I'm just going to read a portion of it now because I think it bears repeating. And I wrote that article as part of a contribution to the debate that was going on around the Northern Ireland Protocol at the time. But nevertheless, I think it applies in general terms, particularly in Northern Ireland. And I wrote, I quote, "As a disciple of Jesus Christ, who happens to be a church leader, the principal questions which I ask myself at this time are, how will what I do or say express my discipleship of Jesus Christ? And how will it contribute to the common good?" And I went on to say, church leaders are not party political figures, nor are we the accredited representatives of any political community. I would guess that the majority of Church of Ireland people in Northern Ireland are unionists, one sort or another, and most Church of Ireland people in the Republic of Ireland broadly nationalist. But probably there is a substantial minority, particularly of people under 40, and particularly weighted towards women, in both jurisdictions, who would class themselves as neither or other. Fortunately for all those people, there are a large number of very well paid elected representatives of political parties and political communities who are more than willing and able to speak for those groups in those terms and as such. So as a leader, a church leader, I do not speak for, with or to the church or to broader society in that way, in that party political way. It's not for me as a church leader to parade the political affiliation of Church of Ireland people in those terms. In many ways, their political and constitutional affiliation is none of my business. And the alignment of denominational and political affiliation has been a feature of our history, and it has only succeeded in making many people in society suspicious of where the Church's conclusive loyalty lies. And in doing so, it has impeded the Church's usefulness in the world, and it has at times cheapened the gospel and its implications. And just to make it as clear as I possibly can, I also said in that article, the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, and this shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody, the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ is not a unionist, and he's not a nationalist, and he's not a neither. He is the sovereign Lord of all people, a God of justice and mercy, who desires the good of all. And for those of us who are organised in churches on an all-island basis, that's especially important to remember. So that's the end of that little bit. So that second preliminary out of the way, if I could maybe identify, again, sort of full disclosure, the imperatives which guide my thinking and doing in civic life, and to which all other sources and authorities are subject and subordinate and are to be judged in relation to. And these words that I'm going to use about that authority, that ultimate authority for me and for, I think, for most Christian people, will be very familiar to anyone who has participated in an Anglican Eucharist. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. And you shall love your neighbour as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets. And that's to say that those few words are a summary of the whole revelation of the nature of God and of our response to that revelation. So what do I mean by the law of love, and why do I believe it applies to groups in society as well as to individuals? And just to be clear, when I use the word love, I don't mean a vague, warm feeling. I don't mean an intense romantic passion. I mean goodwill and benevolence towards people. Love is the thing which binds together against hatred and dishonesty. The law of love is an expression of the nature of God, therefore universal in scope and in application. But it applies in different ways to individuals and to groups. And to mix up those categories when we're thinking about it is one of the reasons why it can be applied irrelevantly and ineffectively. In the case of groups, that law of love is indirect and limited. I'll use an uncontroversial example in a trade union. The law of love is indirect for a trade union in that a trade union has no obligation and, as a rule, no right to be generous in its negotiations. Its duty is to promote the interests of its members justly. However, both trade unions and employers are called upon to act as servants of the community of which they are a part, and to be guided in relation to that community by the spirit of goodwill and honesty. To put it another way, the demand of love for God calls for absolute surrender. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. There is nothing in the life of a believer or in the life of the world over which God does not say, that is mine. That is mine. But the love of neighbour is relative and limited. We are to love him or her as ourselves. We are to love him or her as ourselves. So in no case is a moral agent to prefer the interests of his neighbour to his own, required to put them on the same level. And that will include the assertion of our own interests if they are not put on a level with our neighbours. However, for the community, which includes both us and our neighbours alike, we are required to temper our interests in the interest of the common good. That is, that wider loyalties should be a check on narrower ones. And I don't think that that saying of our Lord's about loving our neighbour as ourselves as opposing to loving God with all of ourselves is in any sense accidental. I think it encapsulates in a way, an almost unbelievably simple way, the basis on which human societies can flourish and can grow. So therefore, in the terms of groups within our societies, or ethnic groups, or any sort of groups within our society, the way of love lies not through altruism, but through reasonable claim and just award. In short, through justice. Within the church, between its members, the true form and expression of love is forgiveness. Within the groups which make up a society, of many of whom are not believers, the true form and expression of love is justice. And so long as society is organised in groups with diverging interests, so long love must express itself first in justice. I'm not going to address the fact that justice is not a word with a fixed meaning. It has different meanings in different contexts, but that's a different discussion to be had, and a much more technical one, I suppose, in many ways to be had. So perhaps now it's worthwhile reflecting on the common interests of church and society, on where those concerns and interests overlap. And the place where they overlap is in the area of citizenship, of what it means to be a good citizen. What are the distinguishing characteristics of a citizen in the modern world? A citizen in the ancient world, say in the world of the New Testament, to answer that question, what is a citizen, was obvious enough. A citizen was someone who was not a slave. He or she was not someone whose choices and identity were owned by someone else. Or as the lawyers today would say, someone who had the liberty to dispose of his or her own acts. And just like a citizen in the ancient world, a modern citizen is someone who has a voice in the community, who has certain legal protections, and who has a significant say in the choices of his or her own life. So the citizen has the personal dignity of making a contribution to the community or society where they live, making a contribution to the shared vision of that community. To be a citizen is to be responsible for maintaining your personal and your social environment. A voice guaranteed a hearing, a voice and a person protected by law. Some of you will remember how St. Paul, on a couple of occasions in the Acts of the Apostles, wrong-footed those who were trying to push him around and to shut down his voice by reminding them he was a Roman citizen, that he was protected by law against that sort of abuse. And the idea of citizenship was very important in the early days of the church. The Greek word ecclesia, which we translate church, was the word used in the ancient world for an assembly of citizens. The church didn't make up a new word for what they understood themselves to be when they gathered for worship or when they gathered for debate. They simply used the familiar word that meant a gathering of citizens, a people who were guaranteed a voice and were guaranteed responsibility. From the very start, the church said to its members that regardless of the political arrangements around you, there is another polis, another political unit in which you have non-negotiable rights, a gift to share, a place where you have the dignity of being a decision maker, able to contribute to the place where you live. And all of that had and still has consequences for the communities of which we are part. Early Christianity was not an opting out of political or social life and conversation. It did not aim to remove people from civic responsibility. It was the place where the deepest kind of civic responsibility was nurtured and carried out into the world. And in some cases, the depth of that citizenship within the ecclesia, within the assembly, was so deep that it came into conflict with the political expectations of the state, with very tragic results. That's why one of the reasons Christianity disappears almost entirely from the official record between the canonical period until the reign of Constantine, and it surfaces only sporadically in the record of martyrdoms. That's the times and places when the church's ideal of citizenship clashed with the ideals of the state. Part of the purpose of Christian community is to learn to treat people as capable of civic dignity and freedom, as people capable of contributing to their nearer and wider social and political environment by free decision taken in consultation. That's what civic society is. Free decision taken in consultation. And from that point of view, the citizens' assemblies, which we call the church, are places where we argue and debate about what we understand is good for the whole of society. The major occupational hazard of faith communities is to opt out or to take for granted their understanding of the societies in which they live. And conversely, the occupational hazard of politics and of politicians is losing touch with the essential values, and this is very important, with the essential values that cannot be constituted by the processes of politics itself. And I'll enlarge upon that a little bit later. Now, needless to say, that positive and creative picture of the overlapping interests of citizenship, both in the ecclesia and in other civic bodies, has at times gone badly wrong. And one way in which it has gone wrong is when the church understood itself to constitute a rival identity to all other civic and political assemblies, that it was the real political unit because it had God on its side. And that was a fatal mistake of the Western medieval church, to see itself as a rival state with a rival government and its own system of law, and governed by clergy, governed by specialists, governed by a kind of a caste of people. And it was hardly surprising that lots of early modern monarchs and parliaments took a dim view of this, just at the point when they were attempting to establish their own authority in legal terms and in rational terms. But the other mistake, and this has been much more the case in Northern Ireland, I think, and in some other places like South Africa at the time. The other mistake is for the church and for Christians to think that their citizenship in the citizens' assembly of the ecclesia and in the world are entirely a private matter, that they're just something that goes on inside our own heads, that it doesn't matter about the actual political and social circumstances in which we live, no matter how miserable or oppressive or simply unfair they are, because we're going to heaven. In the worst scenario, that has led Christians to being tools of oppressive regimes, displaying the sort of attitude that says, you're a child of God with all the dignity that implies, just don't expect the conditions in which you live to respect any of that dignity. Then there are others who, in either complete ignorance or complete contempt for the long tradition of Christian involvement in civic life and in civic thinking, who say, and any bishop or any churchman knows this, as soon as they say something, someone will say, stick to the law of God and leave the other stuff to the professionals. But this is the law of God, according to the Deuteronomist. There shall be no poor among you. And according to our Lord, to love your neighbour as yourself and to do unto others as you wish they would do to you. From the very earliest book of the Bible, the book of the prophet Amos, we need always to be attentive to this warning. I despise your religious festivals. Your assemblies are a stench to me. Even though you bring me burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. Though you bring choice fellowship offerings, I will have no regard for them. Away with the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the music of your harps. But let justice roll on like a river, and righteousness like a never-failing stream. I've just described, as it were, two historical mistakes. And if we are to avoid making them again, we in the church, as we contribute to a civic society, then our contribution needs to be thoughtful, it needs to be collaborative, and it needs to be along with other civic assemblies. We need sometimes what's called, in shared readings of the Bible across traditions, we need a thing called epistemological humility, to acknowledge that there are a host of ways of uncovering and verifying truth. Scientific, technological, sociological, artistic, theological. But that anything that is true is God's truth, regardless of the discipline by which it has been arrived at. Christian citizenship within the ecclesia and in the world is about people of flesh and blood and the realities of their lives. In the City of God, Augustine outlines two kinds of human belonging together and two kinds of love. It's not so much the book about political or constitutional systems, it's about ways of human beings living with each other in a particular place. Do we live by bearing one another's costs and one another's burdens, or do we live at one another's expense? those are the two great human options that Augustine posits. For Augustine, if you go however slowly or fitfully for the first, you're helping to build the city of God. If you live by any other principle than bearing one another's burdens, it's not just that you're going for second best, but what you're really opting for is a form of chaos. And the best that you can hope for or achieve is randomly controlled selfishness. So it's not a matter of the church tying itself or its vision to the agenda of this party or that party, nor of the church creating a political party to advance its own priorities, another mistake often made in Christian history. It's a matter of the church shaping its own life as a place where burdens are shared and encouraging the generosity and mutuality in the communities in which it is placed. And it is a great challenge to the church in Ireland to reshape its life in this way, so that it has a much deeper gift to bring into civic life. It's not our job, I should say, to create Christians to go out and make a public nuisance of themselves, although there are many creative ways of being a public nuisance in a democratic society. It's that we have learned in our ecclesia, what we learn there should provide us with an antennae, to sniff out when people in civic or public life are using language that demeans or diminishes human beings, or when they're telling lies about human beings, or telling lies about God. And when politics is dominated by creating fear and scapegoats, then those antennae should spring into action, because fear and division-generating politics is not mature political discourse. It's not real politics. It's playing with paranoia, which is the dangerous opposite of serving the community and building the community up in a spirit of love. Some of you may have noted the Irish church leaders on St. Patrick's Day 2021 put out a statement which deliberately coincided with the anniversary of the founding of the State of Northern Ireland and the partition. And from my point of view, that statement, which we put together, or together, as it were, each of us collaborating, from my point of view, it was a very tentative and modest attempt to embody some of the ideas and outlook which I've just outlined in the use of the term ecclesia. It reflected the citizens' assembly, which we call the church, discussing, that is, the church leaders together, discussing and arguing about our own vocation and our own relationships and our relationship with the societies in which we live. And in that statement, we admitted that we had to acknowledge and lament the times when we failed to bring to a fearful and divided society that message of deeper connection that binds us, despite our different identities, as children of God made in his image and likeness. And we went on to say, we have often been captive churches, not captive to the word of God, but captive to the idols of state and nation. Gone further to say, churches alongside other civic leaders have a role to play in providing spaces outside political structures that give expression to our interconnectedness and shared concern for the common good. And it's our hope that shared reflection on our past will support and strengthen this engagement, inspiring us to renew our commitment to the work of building peace together. So do we have a part to play? Are there insights from Christian social ethics which can both do justice to the riches of personal life and also form a basis for a culture which is capable of healing the divisions in our societies? Is there something in what I said earlier about essential values that cannot be constituted by the process of politics alone? At the inauguration of that Centre for Religion, Human Values and International Relations at DCU, it was opened by the then Taoiseach Micheál Martin, and he said this: "The challenge is to interpret and apply our high-level values in a world which is changing rapidly. It's important this work is done on the concepts and principles that encourage a mutually beneficial engagement by political leaders and other stakeholders and religious actors." Which is a rather complicated way, I think, of saying something that Robert Schumann said slightly more concisely when he said, the peace of the world cannot be maintained without creative efforts commensurate with the threat. The peace of the world cannot be maintained without creative efforts commensurate with the threat. So on a smaller scale, but in just as much depth, the same can be said of peace and well-being on this island, which will require the creative efforts of citizens and civic society, as well as politicians, to keep this place that we live in working. In traditional thought, in Western politics, or local or national, political life at an electoral level, at a representative level, arises out of the pre-existent life of society. It is nothing without it. George Orwell called that the little battalions that exist below the level of representative politics. And every democracy will only be as good as the forces which sustain it. Democracy presupposes a pre-existent reality, shared principles, a shared sense of belonging, and a feeling of trust. In liberal democracies, the citizen is not a slave afraid of the state, but nor are they indifferent to the state. The citizen recognises that political authority is the exercise of power which is morally justified, and that only his or her willing consent and consent of fellow citizens can provide that legitimacy. Since the Enlightenment was the stable for many horses to run out of, and one of the horses which has kind of persisted, or one of the ideas which has persisted, is of an inner free human being who is making decisions against the backcloth of a mechanical universe, and it makes the mistake of assuming that choice is the same as freedom. And that has accelerated hugely in the age of consumer capitalism and now of surveillance capitalism. But it's not an accurate description of life or lived experience. We live a shared common life in families and associations and communities, and these are the places where our knowing and formation take place. Deep truths unfolding in community and in time over generations. And so it is with civic society and the demos which emerges from it and which sustains it. And our current political arrangements do not foster or in any proper sense allow for that dynamic and creative participation in any really meaningful way. And that understanding of society is very firmly rooted in the Christian understanding of the superabundance of God, the place of God-given difference. And of course it tends towards a pluralist society, which the churches in many ways set their faces against at a time. And as a result of which you have in France, you have laicite, where effectively the church has no voice whatsoever in the public square. Not that long ago, we had a meeting in Armagh with an official from the French government, and when a clergy person turned up, she didn't want to have her photograph taken. What's the priest doing here? A strong reaction as a result, and it's peculiar, obviously, when France thinks of normality. It's a normality that began in 1789. It's a normality that began with a great revolution, a great rupturing of society. Now that's not the case generally in the Anglophone world, but nevertheless, it's important that we recognise that pluralist does not mean secular. It means that everyone has a voice, that everyone has a part to play and values that voice. But pluralist societies also need stabilising forces. In successful pluralist societies throughout history, it's been achieved by one or more of a number of factors. Sometimes the binding power of religion, sometimes a shared sense of history, sometimes a living cultural heritage, always the integrating power of strong mixed neighbourhoods. Some of those things don't exist in Northern Ireland at all, and very often insofar as they exist, for instance, a sense of history, they're divisive. rather than making for binding together. And although it's a very modest thing that the church leaders do, and that something like the St. Patrick's Day statement or the service of hope and reflection which we had in the cathedral last year, they are intended at least to model the idea that religion, and of course, its root word, the root of the word means binding together. But Christianity in Ireland hasn't bound people together, it has divided them. And ours is a very modest attempt. And it has been for the generations before us as well, the 3 or 4 generations before us, that it should be something that binds us together. It's not even an ecumenical project in that sense. It's nothing to do with the alteration or negotiation of core beliefs. It's to do with living out our vocation as peacemakers with integrity. And in terms of the practical outworking of what it is I'm saying, it does seem to me that there is some usefulness for some kind of multi-layered consultative process which can sit alongside the day-to-day negotiations, the sort of granular lawmaking in which our representatives protect immediate interests, but alongside that or underneath that. It's not intended to undermine electoral democracy. It's intended, as it were, to provide it with a food that there should be this structured civic dialogue. And it's very interesting that, as I have read through those Windsor framework documents, that there are proposals for structured civic dialogue, which is nowhere else offered to any other country in the community, in the European community. But is, I think, particularly valuable to us because the political structures are still so uncertain. They break down quite often, but the life of society still goes on. Life of business, life of sport, the life of voluntary organisations, life of disability organisations, women organisations, they still go on and could still form, as it were, a continuity. And also, in a sense, form an upward pressure on political representatives not to allow differences to get so deep that the structures themselves collapse. And it's not an impossible dream. During the COVID pandemic, it worked in a lot of places and in a lot of ways. That it was civic society in cooperation with the state who were able to engineer the huge behavioural changes that were needed by individuals and by groups in order to get us through that period. And it seemed to me that that was a good example of this sort of civic life and civic world and civic society interacting very positively with elected representatives in order to create and to reach something that was good for all. And shouldn't remember 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, that it was civic society who put the squeeze on in many ways to help politicians get over the line. There were lots of other things, but civic society was, in maybe not a particularly systematic way or structured way, but nevertheless were there. And again, particularly women's groups. And it's been my experience ministering in Northern Ireland, growing up in a working class community in Belfast, that those women's groups kept going throughout everything. The contacts were kept, and it was kept, the constitutional politics were kept out of it. It was what was good for communities that was kept in. And where the churches, sorry, the other thing about this structured civic dialogue is that it results in friendship as a political and a social and a civic virtue. People who are committed to working together and continuing to work together towards a common goal, and who see themselves on a journey rather than as people sparking off one another all the time. And you can't legislate for trust or for loyalty or for friendship or for solidarity. What else can the churches do in terms of the development of civic society? It may seem very paradoxical to say so, but it may help the democratic process that we are not democratically accountable to a voter base or to a vast electorate. It was one of those great paradoxes in British political life that the most popular person was the most undemocratic person, the Queen. She had an 83% approval rating. and was therefore a symbol of unity in a way which I think many people underestimate the monarchy in that sense. But here it's a little bit different. So we're not accountable to a vast electorate, but if we are to contribute, then our contribution has to be judicious, and it has to avoid desperately ridden hobby horses. It has to avoid being fixated with one or two issues and not with much broader issues. It has to be spoken in a way, rather like as I opened up with, in the manner it has to be spoken of in a way that it's not being offered from Mount Sinai. It's just our best efforts, and they're to be seen alongside the efforts of everyone else. And I get very suspicious when somebody opens up a statement by saying every right-thinking, every right-thinking unionist, every right-thinking nationalist, every right-thinking welder, whatever it is, it's a kind of a factory setting for politicians. And I think the response is, in a democratic society, I do my own thinking with people who I trust. Thank you very much, all the same. And there is a sense in which every person in a democracy is a politician and has those responsibilities to think in that way. Another reason why the churches have, I think, a particular role, and particularly in Northern Irish society, is that we can say things that others are feeling but feel it's too risky to say. Many people live in small communities, in cities and towns and villages everywhere, and they're not governed by an assembly, and they're not governed by an executive. They're governed by violent men with violent opinions. And they can be very frightening when they're written on a gable wall or on an anonymous Twitter account. So it's good that from time to time, those of us who are not accountable can say things that need to be heard and need to give encouragement and comfort to people who find themselves in very difficult positions. I'm sort of getting there, I think. I hope it's not. Very often I hear the complaint from all sorts of quarters that the church or the bishops or the moderator or the president of the Methodist Church, whoever, are not being prophetic enough. And generally what people mean when they say that is that they want the church or the bishop or the moderator or whoever to agree with their point of view in a very loud voice. That's what they mean by being prophetic. And the word prophet, and I'm very conscious that I'm speaking in the presence of an Old Testament scholar of some standing, but the word prophet is an important one, and it's important that it's used correctly. In the religious sense, the prophet is someone who calls Israel back to its true and foundational allegiance to Yahweh, the God of the covenant. And Yahweh was essentially the one who had heard their cry of suffering and who had brought them out of the land of bondage and out of the house of slavery. It was Yahweh who had made them free citizens of Israel and had given them a law to govern their life as this new community. And that law emphasised that just as they had been dealt with generously and with patience and forbearance, so they were to be generous and patient and forbearing too. And that's the prophetic voice of the church, or any prophetic voice. And there have been prophetic voices. And I would say, and if he was here, he would probably shoot me for saying, John Dunlop, a sort of great Presbyterian patriarch, has been a prophetic voice, calling us back, and calling particularly his own community back to their allegiance to this picture of God as he is revealed to us in Jesus Christ. So the prophet says, don't you forget and don't let me forget that this is how we have been treated and how we are to treat other people. And Yahweh didn't treat us like this for some reasons of utility or for a short term. He did it because it's his nature. It's his nature. And therefore, if anything is to endure, it must reflect that nature. So our prophetic calling isn't necessarily to make radical noises. It's to strive with all our energy to identify the truths that lie behind the divisions and the short-term advantage, and to try to identify what it is beyond winning and losing, and to call people back to those sustaining and those sustainable truths. And most of all, that prophetic calling, believe it or not, requires a great deal of patience. And that's not something the prophets were necessarily thought to have to possess. Patience to uncover those truths that are beyond winning and losing, beyond blame and fear. And to do that, we need to be able to develop a capacity to be quiet enough to learn. That's what contemplatives do. That's what the big word means, to be quiet enough to learn. And Jesus spoke with such authority because he loved silence. But perhaps primarily the church can contribute to the development of society and the identity of the citizen by treating everyone it encounters within and beyond its boundaries as people capable of mature thought and action, self-aware and self-critical, willing to carry the cost of others and not only to talk about the cost to themselves. I'll finish now, literally in 2 minutes. Philip McDonough, a paper he wrote for a Polish journal earlier this year, and he was reflecting on Pope Benedict XVI's understanding of history, and he relates a story of a little German boy, who asks a famous German writer, "Wie spät ist es?" which is one of the ways, and even my schoolboy German, which is one of the ways of asking what time is it, but it actually means literally, how late is it? And in a way, that's the question that's being asked, I think, now at this moment in the history of this country and of these islands. What point have we reached in human history of these islands? Are we at a point of breakdown or a point of breakthrough? Neither of those are instantaneous or surprise events. They're always carried in the womb of history and are the product of conscious choices. And history isn't what it always has been in Ireland. It isn't something that you just have to understand and endure. History is the process whereby we can make a world more humane and more democratic. It's a process which, through conscientious decision and from those who come from a position of belief of gift of God, we can produce an us that doesn't currently exist, but is latent in the womb. An us who are deeply involved in the nature of political legitimacy, and for that reason abhor the threats of malevolent fanaticism whose only contribution to community life, again particularly in Northern Ireland, has been to destroy its own front room. And us who will help shape transparent representative structures which can provide effective scrutiny rather than the popular caricature of what constitutes the investigation of accountability in public life at the moment, which is essentially journalism of one sort or another. A few weeks ago, this is a story to finish. A few weeks ago, I had to meet my daughter on the south bank of the Thames. She lives in London, and I wasn't entirely surprised when she messaged me to say that she was on a bus in the Isle of Dogs and that she would be another 30 minutes, and that of course means an hour. So I went into, there's a Foyle's bookshop there in the South Bank beside a very good pret-a-manger, and I went in to buy a book which was slim enough to make a bit of an inroad in, as it were, in an hour. And I hadn't read Claire Keegan's novella Foster, so I bought it and I sat in the winter sun on the South Bank and read it. And the book's about a young girl temporarily fostered to an aunt while the girl's mother is preparing for the birth of another baby in an already neglectful home. The girl's father drives her to her sister-in-law's and leaves her there without even a kiss or a hug, but says as he goes out to his sister-in-law, "She'll eat, but you can work her." And for some reason or other, some of the girl's thoughts struck me very forcibly as I read them. I'll leave them with you. She said, part of me wants my father to leave me here, while another part of me wants to take me back to what I know. I'm in a spot where I can neither be what I always am, nor turn into what I could be. And I sometimes think that's the state of being that we have existed in for quite a number of years. So I'm sorry if that was inchoate rather than discursive, but thank you very much for your patience.
Archbishop, thank you so much for that wonderful and incredibly moving in many ways discourse that I think none of us will forget for a while, and I hope very much that you'll leave the text with us and it will be in our library and museum in the future. Generally, we don't in the Royal Irish Academy, when we have a discourse, have questions afterwards. But I couldn't help but think when you talked about right-thinking people that I thought of Adlai Stevenson when he was running for president in 1956, I think against Dwight Eisenhower, and he gave a speech and a lady got up and said, she said, you know, every right-thinking person will support you. And he said, madam, that's enough. That's not enough. I need a majority. So, but we do thank you enormously for that. And I now turn to Professor Rosalind Pritchard, who will propose a vote of thanks. But as I say, we'd love to keep this discourse and put it in our library. And thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure and my privilege to propose the vote of thanks to the Archbishop and indeed to a number of other people who have made this event possible. I'm grateful to the Royal Irish Academy and to the chair of the North-South Standing Committee, Professor Jerry McKenna, for inviting me to propose this vote of thanks. By the way, the Royal Irish Academy is today celebrating International Women's Day. Isn't that right, Jerry? So it's been to some trouble over that. I was particularly interested in proposing this vote of thanks because I knew the Archbishop already. Some years ago, he was the rector of a parish called St. Paul's Kildalla, which is near Coleraine, which is where I live, and I was a member of his congregation. I met him again in an ecclesiastical context when I went to Holy Trinity Church in Dunfanaghy to attend a service that he was conducting. It was a parish of which my late father used to be rector. I was a member of the Church of Ireland Board of Education, of which the Archbishop was chair. So I very much looked forward to this lecture, and I certainly have not been disappointed. It was Jonathan Swift, who was the Dean of St. Patrick's Cathedral, Dublin, who produced the famous saying, "We have just enough religion to make us hate, but not enough to make us love one another." And it was another Dean of St. Patrick's, this time Dean Victor Griffin, who wrote movingly in his autobiography, Mark of Protest, about the battle for pluralism in Ireland. He describes the votes on abortion and divorce, which were among the most salient and the most agonizing of his time. The devil is often in the detail, and details can become divisive. Christian unity in diversity can be achieved, but at a high level of generality, and Victor Griffin believes that tolerance is recognizing and respecting a diversity of views and recognizing and respecting also the dignity of every person, to love our neighbours as ourselves. Of course, this has become increasingly difficult in the complexity of modern Irish society, as the Archbishop has pointed out so thoughtfully and in such an interesting manner. He has offered us a wonderful meditation on the role of the Church and he has offered us an inspirational discourse. The Church can champion an integral part of Irish society which promotes civic virtue on the part of those both inside and outside the Church. As the Archbishop said, the citizen has voice and choice and is in the pursuit of sustainable truths and the structured civic dialogue. So the first person that we would like to thank would certainly be the Archbishop for his discourse. I would also like to thank some other people here. I'd like to thank Andrew Mayes for introducing the event, and I'd like to thank Ursula Monaghan, Library and Museum Coordinator. I would like to thank Dennis Melville for coordinating the audiovisual setup, Joe Moran for backup support, and in respective rooms and parking, Mark Connolly for organisational support, Siobhan Buchanan-Johnston for catering, Martin Fox, a volunteer, without which nothing, Michael Murray, the technician. We would all like to thank the Royal Irish Academy, and in the person of Karen Muldowney, who has done a lot, I think, to facilitate this meeting. And of course, we would like to thank Jerry, who has the interest of this wonderful priory so very deeply at heart. And we would like to thank the Priory itself. And finally, I would like to thank you, the attendees, and it has been wonderful to have you here to enable this memorable event to take place. So shall we thank the Archbishop and all the others?
Just to say, there will be refreshments across the courtyard in the cafe or the tea room that we have over there. So thank you again, Archbishop, and thank all of you for coming. Thank you. Mind we just keep this as
Yeah, no, we can, but I can say that electronically.
Yeah,
That's
great,
usually
yeah.
probably the bit. But do by all means, yeah, do by all means.